the dog who chewed off his owner's leg. Why this happened will shock you. It sounds impossible, but it's true. Shadow, a loyal Rottweiler, did something no one could have ever predicted. He chewed off his owner's leg. But why? What could have possibly driven this dog to take such a drastic step? The truth is stranger and more shocking than you can imagine. Was it desperation? Was it love? If you think you know, think again. If you're curious to discover the unbelievable reason behind Shadow's decision and how this changed everything, don't go anywhere. Stay with us to find out why this dog's incredible loyalty will leave you speechless. This is the story of a bond so deep it defies all logic. Keep watching to uncover the shocking truth behind Shadow's heroic act. A happy beginning. Jimmy's life was a simple one, full of love and laughter. Every morning, he woke up to the sound of birds singing outside his window and the warm rays of the sun peeking through the curtains. His family was his everything. His beautiful wife, Elena, the one person who understood him in ways no one else could, and their young son, Liam, who had endless energy and a heart as big as the world itself. Their home was always bustling with joy. Elena, with her gentle nature and radiant smile, was the glue that held their world together. She would hum quietly in the kitchen, preparing meals for their family, while Jimmy and Liam would play around her, making silly jokes and laughing at each other's antics. But no matter what they were doing, there was one constant that always brought them peace. Their dog, Shadow. Shadow, the Rottweiler, was more than just a pet. He was the very heartbeat of their home. His thick black fur, which shimmered in the sunlight, and his imposing frame made him look intimidating to anyone who didn't know him. But to Jimmy and his family, Shadow was a gentle giant, loyal, loving, and always protective. He had a way of making everyone feel safe, as though nothing in the world could hurt them while he was around. Every day, Shadow's loyalty shone through in small, almost unnoticed ways. When Jimmy went for his daily jog, Shadow was always by his side. He would trot beside him, never too far ahead but always perfectly in tune with his owner's pace. The dog's stride was steady, and his dark eyes would scan the surroundings, making sure no danger lurked nearby. When the jog ended and they reached home, Shadow would walk with Jimmy to the door, as if ensuring that they had made it safely back to the place where they belonged. At home, Shadow's bond with Elena was equally special. She loved to sit by the window, reading books and sipping tea while the world outside moved by. Shadow would lie down on the rug beside her, keeping a watchful eye on the yard. His sharp ears would twitch at the slightest sound, and if any unfamiliar noise reached his ears, he would raise his head, his dark gaze scanning the horizon. Elena never felt alone when Shadow was near. His mere presence made everything feel right. But it was with little Liam that Shadow's affection was most evident. From the moment Liam was born, Shadow had taken on a special role in his life. The dog was always there for him, playing, protecting, and guiding him. Whenever Liam was upset, Shadow would nudge him gently with his nose, comforting him without a word. When Liam began to learn how to walk, it was Shadow who followed him closely, ensuring he didn't fall. And as Liam grew, the two became inseparable. The dog would chase after tennis balls with him for hours, and in return, Liam would feed Shadow his favorite treats and talk to him about his day. Their home was a peaceful haven, where laughter filled the rooms and the scent of freshly cooked meals lingered in the air. Shadow's presence made everything feel complete. There was a sense of safety and warmth that enveloped the family, and it was easy to forget that anything could disrupt the fragile bubble of happiness they had built. They didn't realize how much they depended on that sense of security until the world around them came crashing down. It was on a typical Saturday afternoon when everything changed. The family had planned a weekend getaway to a nearby nature reserve. a place where they could escape the demands of everyday life and reconnect with each other. The drive was peaceful, with the sun casting a golden glow over the landscape. The chatter in the car was light, full of stories about what they would do once they reached the reserve. Jimmy, who was usually the one driving, was in high spirits, enjoying the rare opportunity to spend time with his family away from the usual routine. Elena and Liam were in the back seat, both of them excited to explore the trails and enjoy the outdoors. But as the sun began to dip below the horizon, the calm and joy of their journey was shattered in an instant. A reckless driver swerved into their lane without warning, and before Jimmy could react, there was a deafening crash. The sound of metal crunching and glass shattering filled the air, followed by an eerie silence. Everything went black. Jimmy slowly regained consciousness in a hospital bed, his mind foggy and disoriented. The first thing he noticed was the blinding white light above him and the beeping of machines surrounding him. He felt an excruciating pain in his leg, a sharp, gnawing ache that made his stomach turn. His thoughts were jumbled, and it took him several moments before he realized what had happened. The car had lost control, swerving off the road and crashing into a tree. Elena and Liam had been trapped inside. Elena had been critically injured, and despite the efforts of the paramedics, she didn't survive the impact. Liam, miraculously, had only suffered a few scratches and bruises but was in a state of shock. Jimmy's world tilted, and the room seemed to spin. Every step he took towards the emergency room felt like it carried the weight of 1,000 pounds. He reached the door and was met by the cold gaze of a nurse who ushered him into a small, sterile room. The silence inside was deafening. Dr. Matthews entered shortly after, her face weary and tired. She didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Mr. Carter, we did everything we could," she said, her voice low. "Your wife, Elena, passed away due to severe internal injuries. We weren't able to save her." Jimmy felt as though the air had been knocked out of him. His knees buckled, and he collapsed into the chair beside him. It felt unreal, like a nightmare he couldn't wake from. His mind couldn't process the words. He had just spoken to her hours ago, and now she was gone. The mother of his son, his partner, his best friend, she was gone. Then the doctor's voice cut through his spiraling thoughts. "We've found something else, though. It's about your leg." Jimmy looked up, his head spinning with grief, unable to fully comprehend what she was saying. "You sustained a severe injury to your left leg during the accident, Mr. Carter. However, there's something more concerning. We've detected an infection that is spreading rapidly. There's a possibility it could be cancer. If left untreated, it could spread and put your life at risk. We need to begin treatment immediately." The words barely registered in Jimmy's mind. He could hardly think straight with the grief gnawing at his insides. His wife was dead, and now, this? Cancer. The idea of facing more hardship felt impossible, and he was overwhelmed by a sense of hopelessness that had never consumed him before. I can't think about that right now," Jimmy muttered, his voice hoarse. "My wife, my son, I need to go to them." Dr. Matthews placed a hand gently on his shoulder, her touch surprisingly warm. "I understand, but please, you need to take care of yourself too. We can begin treatment right away. We can save your leg. Please, let us help you." But Jimmy couldn't listen. His mind was foggy with despair, and the weight of his loss was too much to bear. His thoughts turned inward, consumed with a desire to escape the pain. "I'll sign the papers," he said dully, barely processing what he was agreeing to. "I can't stay here." The doctor hesitated, clearly troubled by his decision, but she gave a reluctant nod. "If you insist, Mr. Carter, but please, reconsider. This infection, it's serious. We can't guarantee your leg will survive if you delay treatment." But Jimmy was beyond reasoning. His grief was a storm that clouded every part of him, making rational thought impossible. With a nod, he signed the release papers and walked out of the hospital, choosing to face the grief head-on, even if it meant sacrificing his own health in the process. As he stumbled back to the family car, the world seemed to slow around him. The pain in his leg was becoming more intense, but it didn't matter. What could be worse than the pain of losing Elena? As Jimmy drove home in a daze, Shadow, the family's loyal Rottweiler, awaited him. The dog, oblivious to the storm that had consumed his family, wagged his tail eagerly, ready to greet Jimmy and offer the unconditional love that only a dog could provide. But even Shadow couldn't help Jimmy escape the dark storm that had just begun. A loyal heart. The days that followed Elena's death felt like a blur. Jimmy had returned home from the hospital, but the warmth of the house no longer felt the same. The air in the living room, once filled with the sound of Elena's laughter and Liam's playful chatter, now seemed hollow, empty. Every corner of the house held the memory of her smile, her voice, her touch, things that would never be again. Jimmy's grief consumed him. The weight of it pressed down on him with an intensity he could hardly endure. He was still reeling from the loss of his wife, the woman who had been the heart of their home. Her absence felt like a gaping hole in his chest. The idea of moving forward without her was unimaginable. But what hurt most was the realization that he couldn't even care for his son, Liam. Liam, who had lost his mother in a way no child should ever have to, was silent and withdrawn. He would sit for hours, staring out the window, as if waiting for her to come back. But no matter how much Jimmy wanted to help, his grief was an immovable barrier between him and his son. Shadow, their loyal Rottweiler, could sense it all. The family's sorrow, the heavy silence in the house. He felt it too. Shadow had always been a faithful companion, but now, in this dark time, he stepped up in ways that no one had expected. Shadow had always been a gentle giant. With his broad frame and soulful eyes, he had been the calm in the midst of chaos, the protector of the family. But now, he was more than just a dog. He was the glue holding the shattered pieces of the family together. Each day, Shadow's presence became more crucial. Every morning, he would nudge Liam awake, leading him to the kitchen for breakfast. He would sit beside him as he ate, never once abandoning his post. When Liam went to school, Shadow would follow him to the bus stop, walking just a few paces behind him, ensuring that no harm would come his way. At home, Shadow kept vigil by Jimmy's side. He would curl up next to him on the couch, his heavy head resting on Jimmy's lap, offering the only comfort he could. He would nudge Jimmy gently with his nose, as if telling him to get up, to move, to fight the darkness. But Jimmy was too lost in his sorrow to listen. As the days turned into weeks, the house grew quieter. The only sounds now were the rustling of leaves outside the window, the ticking of the clock on the wall, and the soft padding of Shadow's paws on the hardwood floor. Jimmy's physical pain, the infection in his leg, had begun to worsen as well. The untreated wound was now visibly swollen, and the stench of decay filled the air around him. But he couldn't bring himself to do anything about it. The idea of seeking treatment seemed so distant, so irrelevant in the face of the grief that consumed him. It was Shadow who finally took action. Jimmy would often retreat to his room, shutting the door behind him as if to escape the world. But Shadow refused to let him drown in his despair. One night, as Jimmy lay motionless on the bed, Shadow paced back and forth in front of the door, whimpering softly. He wasn't sure what he was sensing, but his instincts told him that Jimmy was slipping further away. Shadow had seen death. He had seen the loss of Elena, and now he saw the slow decay of his owner, his friend, his family, He couldn't stand by and watch Jimmy fade away. So, he did what no one expected. He took charge. It started with small acts, fetching the groceries from the porch, nudging the phone toward Jimmy when it rang, helping Liam with his homework. But Shadow knew that these acts alone weren't enough. Jimmy needed more. The family needed more. And that's when Shadow made his decision. One afternoon, Jimmy was in his study, his legs swollen and oozing with infection. He had barely noticed the pain anymore. His thoughts were consumed by the emptiness inside him. Liam had gone to bed early that night, too tired from his own emotional battles. As Jimmy sat alone, a feeling of hopelessness settled over him. He had failed his wife, he had failed his son, and now he was failing himself. Shadow watched quietly from the doorway, his large frame blocking the light from the hallway. There was a fire in his eyes, a determination that only a loyal companion could possess. Shadow was more than a dog. He was Jimmy's lifeline, his protector, and in this moment he would do whatever it took to save him. The dog approached cautiously, his body tense, aware that something needed to change. He moved slowly toward Jimmy's leg, sniffing it. The infection was thick, the stench nearly unbearable. Shadow knew it was bad. He could see the decay, the way the leg was rotting away, and he understood the stakes. Without hesitation, Shadow did the unthinkable. The silent sacrifice. The room was silent. The only sound was the quiet hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen and the occasional drip of water from the leaky faucet in the bathroom. But none of that mattered in this moment. What mattered was the scene before Shadow. Jimmy lay motionless on the floor of the study, his body barely breathing, his leg a grotesque mess of exposed tissue and blood. His face was pale, the usual spark in his eyes now replaced by a haunting emptiness. Shadow stood at the door, his eyes wide with concern, his body trembling slightly with the intensity of what had just happened. The room was filled with the unmistakable smell of decay. The infection in Jimmy's leg had worsened to the point where it seemed as though death had begun to claim him. And yet, despite all the odds, Shadow had done the unthinkable. In an act of unimaginable love and desperation, the Rottweiler had taken it upon himself to sever the infected limb, chewing through Jimmy's leg with agonizing slowness, a grotesque act of mercy. But now, as the blood continued to pool around Jimmy's body, Shadow felt a deep sense of dread. Had he done enough? Was Jimmy going to make it? Shadow had acted instinctively. He had watched his family fall apart, seen the suffering that Jimmy was enduring, and realized that something had to be done, something drastic. In the face of death, Shadow had chosen to sacrifice his own sense of safety, his own comfort, for the man he loved like a father. The grotesque act of amputation was his only option, and he knew that if it didn't work, Jimmy's chances of survival would be slim to none. He stood still for a moment, watching Jimmy's chest rise and fall with shallow breaths, waiting for some sign that his sacrifice had been worth it. And then, just as his anxiety reached its peak, the faintest sound broke the silence. A groan. Jimmy's eyelids fluttered, and then, with a deep, pained inhale, his eyes opened. For a moment, they were unfocused, glazed with confusion. His breath came in ragged gasps as he tried to sit up, his body shaking from the effort. His leg, now nothing more than a stump, throbbed with pain, and the world around him spun in dizzying circles. Shadow's heart skipped a beat. It had worked. With a renewed sense of urgency, Shadow trotted to Jimmy's side, nudging his hand with his wet nose. Jimmy's eyes locked onto him, and in that moment, something passed between them. It was as if Jimmy suddenly understood everything, what had happened, what Shadow had done. The Rottweiler's gaze was filled with a quiet, unspoken love, a bond that had transcended words. Jimmy tried to speak, but his voice came out in a whisper, hoarse and weak. "Shadow." His voice cracked. What happened?" Shadow let out a low whine, then stood over Jimmy protectively, never leaving his side. He had to make sure that Jimmy was safe. He couldn't leave him alone now, not after everything that had happened, not after the sacrifice he had made. With great effort, Jimmy pushed himself into a sitting position, feeling the weight of his missing leg and the cold sweat that had formed on his forehead. His hands trembled as he reached for the phone on the table. He needed help. He couldn't do this alone. The dizziness in his head was overwhelming, but the sight of Shadow, the dog who had saved his life, was enough to keep him grounded. As he dialed the emergency number, Shadow paced around the room, his nervous energy palpable. He could sense that help was on the way, but time was crucial. Jimmy had to be stabilized, or the infection could return. His chances of survival were still far from guaranteed. It wasn't long before the paramedics arrived. They were shocked, to say the least, at the sight of Jimmy, barely conscious, his leg severed in such an unconventional manner. The first responders immediately went to work, stabilizing Jimmy as best they could, but they were puzzled. They couldn't understand what had happened, how he had managed to survive. When they asked Jimmy what had occurred, he could only shake his head, his voice too weak to explain. His mind was still processing the reality of what had happened, but he knew one thing for certain. Shadow had saved his life. As the paramedics loaded him onto the stretcher and wheeled him out, Shadow followed closely, his gaze never leaving Jimmy's face. He wasn't about to let his owner out of his sight. He had already sacrificed so much. He wouldn't abandon him now. The drive to the hospital was a blur. Jimmy drifted in and out of consciousness, his body exhausted, but his mind racing with questions he couldn't answer. He knew what had happened, and yet he didn't. He couldn't wrap his head around the unthinkable decision that Shadow had made. By the time they arrived at the hospital, Jimmy was barely conscious. The medical team rushed him into surgery, but as they prepped him, one question hung in the air. Who had done this? Who had severed his leg? When the doctors and nurses finally had time to piece together the events, they came to an astonishing conclusion. The amputation wasn't performed by human hands. It was as if the infection had been cut away in a desperate attempt to save Jimmy's life. But it wasn't a medical professional who had done it. It was Shadow, a hero in the shadows. The hospital room was stark and sterile, the white walls reflecting the harsh artificial light above. The beeping of machines filled the space, a constant reminder of the fragile thread of life that still clung to Jimmy. He was unconscious, his body covered in bandages, and the doctors had done everything they could to stabilize him. But there was something they couldn't explain: the unorthodox nature of the injury and the strange circumstances surrounding his survival. Jimmy's leg, or what was left of it, had been severed in a way that no medical professional would consider appropriate, and yet it had saved his life. The infection that had once been a death sentence was now gone, the wound clean and healing, thanks to Shadow's unimaginable act of mercy. As Jimmy drifted in and out of consciousness, his mind was a whirlwind of confusion and gratitude. He had tried to understand what had happened, but it was impossible to process in his current state. The image of Shadow chewing through his leg, the pain, the blood, it all felt surreal. He couldn't wrap his head around it, but he knew one thing for sure: Shadow had saved his life. The hours passed slowly, each one heavier than the last. The doctors monitored his vital signs, while nurses tended to his wounds. His heart rate was stable, but he was still in a medically induced coma, his body needing time to heal. The clock ticked on, but Jimmy's mind refused to settle. He kept thinking about Shadow. His loyal Rottweiler, the one who had always been by his side, had gone beyond the call of duty. No one could ever have expected such a drastic act from an animal, let alone a dog. It was as though Shadow knew exactly what needed to be done, and without hesitation he did it. But where was Shadow now? At first, Jimmy had assumed that once he was taken to the hospital, Shadow would be left behind. But something felt off. Shadow never left his side, not in the darkest hours, not when the world seemed to be crumbling around them. His presence had always been a comfort, a steady source of warmth in an otherwise cold world. But now, as he lay in that sterile hospital room, the absence of his companion felt like a physical ache. Hours passed before the nurse returned with an unexpected visitor. Shadow stood at the door. Jimmy's heart skipped a beat. His loyal friend had somehow found his way into the hospital. The nurses were startled, unsure of how the dog had managed to get past security, but Shadow didn't care. He only cared about one thing: being there for Jimmy. The nurses looked at each other, unsure of what to do, but before they could speak, Jimmy's weak voice broke the silence. "It's okay," he whispered. "Let him stay." The nurse hesitated for a moment, then gave a small nod. She had seen the bond between the man and his dog, and knew there was no way to separate them now. Shadow padded into the room and immediately walked to Jimmy's side. His dark eyes filled with a mixture of love, concern, and something deeper, something that transcended words. But it felt different now, darker somehow. It had been weeks since Shadow had made the ultimate sacrifice, and in that time, both the dog and his owner had changed. "Thank you, boy," Jimmy whispered, his voice hoarse with emotion. "You saved my life." Shadow pressed his head against Jimmy's hand, as if understanding the weight of those words. It wasn't just the physical act of saving him that mattered. It was the depth of the loyalty, the love, and the sacrifice that had led to this moment. Jimmy's mind swirled with gratitude, but there was a deep sadness in his heart as well. He had nearly lost everything: his wife, his leg, and his will to live. And yet, here was Shadow, standing by him like a silent guardian, a hero in the shadows. The next few days were a blur of recovery. The doctors were amazed at Jimmy's progress. They attributed his survival to the amputation, but deep down, Jimmy knew the truth. It wasn't just the surgery that had saved him. It was Shadow's willingness to sacrifice his own comfort, his own safety, for the man he loved. As the days went on, the bond between Jimmy and Shadow grew even stronger. They were no longer just owner and dog. They were survivors, warriors in their own right. Jimmy began physical therapy, slowly learning to walk again with the help of a prosthetic leg. It was hard, painful, and frustrating, but he had a reason to push forward now. He had a purpose, one that wasn't just about surviving, but about living. And through it all, Shadow was by his side. No longer just a pet, but a true protector. He had given everything to ensure Jimmy's survival, and now he stood beside him as he took the first tentative steps toward healing. But something had changed within Jimmy. He no longer took life for granted. He no longer took Shadow for granted. The act of sacrifice that Shadow had made had opened his eyes to what really mattered in life: love, loyalty, and the bonds that tied them all together. He had been given a second chance, and he was determined to make the most of it. As Jimmy slowly stood up, gripping the walker with determination, Shadow looked up at him with those deep, knowing eyes. There was no need for words. They both understood. Shadow had saved him once, and now it was Jimmy's turn to save his friend, to give him the life he deserved.